direction of the Sardinia attack is coming this way. Both sides were having a fairly long-range gun duel. So he's going to plug them in there in these fields here. They're going to go down this road, and they're going to be attacking. The French are going to be approaching this area from the valley to my right. And the Imperial Guard, along with the help of the First Corps, have nearly secured Solferino. Okay, Rick, tell us briefly about your specialty and your appreciation for the military history of Italy during the 19th century.
Well, my specialty is the age of Napoleon, but also the 19th century and war and warfare. And I'm particularly fascinated with the war in the age of the Risorgimento because I have a great curiosity for Italian military history. I started my research in graduate school on the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy and the Italian army in the Napoleonic Kingdom of Italy. And it played a very important role within the empire of Napoleon I. And later in my career, I wanted to continue that study into the legacy of that army and its impact on the unification movement in the 19th century. And so I had this wonderful opportunity to write a history of the War of 1859, the Second War of Italian Unification, for the Italian Army Historical Service. And that was my opportunity to pursue a subject that I really enjoyed. Italian history is rich. It is, in the English language, horribly understudied. Actually, in most European languages except Italian, it's horribly understudied. And I consider it the Rodney Dangerfield of military history. It doesn't get the respect it deserves. And so I have, for the past decade or more than a decade now, had the pleasure of working on Italian military history in the 19th century, which really is wonderful, filled with a lot of surprises, and I think offers another dimension to understanding the war in the age of not just Italian unification, but war in the age of the Industrial Revolution.
Well, now let's turn to Italy in 1859 and the armies involved. Let's start with the Piedmontese. How prepared was the King's army to take on the Austrians?
The Piedmontese army was perhaps the best prepared it had ever been. It was ill-prepared in 1848 for the First War of Italian Unification and was not as well prepared in 1866 for the Third War of Italian Unification. But for 1859, King Victor Emmanuel could not have asked for a better army, better trained army, better leadership, and better quality troops, and in many ways could not ask for better weaponry, at least at that time, based on the technological developments. The Piedmontese army, about 1/3 of the army that marches off to war in 1859, served in the Crimean War. which was 1855, 1856 for the Piedmontese intervention. So many of the Piedmontese senior officers, the general officers, a lot of general officers, many of the senior officers, and quite a number of junior officers had practical military experience on the battlefields of the Crimea. And there they experienced what war had become or evolved into since the First War of 1848. So it provided very important practical experience. In addition, the Piedmontese army worked hand in hand with the British and French allies in the Crimean War, and therefore that relationship extended from 1854-55 through 1859. Similarly, Piedmontese military intelligence had coordinated and worked well with the British and the French. In particular, the Piedmontese military observer in the Crimea was at that time Captain Giuseppe Gavone, who by 1859 was a colonel and head of Piedmontese military intelligence. So there was a great continuity between working with allies. There was a great deal of experience, practical battlefield experience. And then the Piedmontese army undergoes significant reform in 1854 that were directed by the Minister of War, Alfonso La Marmora. And La Marmora, in many ways, modernized the organizational system, the staff system of the Piedmontese army, which was wholly insufficient, as was seen in 1848-49 in the First War of Italian Unification. The ability to mobilize the army quickly, to have properly trained reserves, let alone properly trained soldiers in the standing army, was inadequate in 1848-49. But La Marmora's reforms create a system that is on par with what the French will have. In fact, the Piedmontese in almost all ways copy the French military system. They had copied it since Napoleon I and the Army of the Kingdom of Italy in the age of Napoleon I. And now, under Napoleon III, we see the Piedmontese copy the French system in that continuation with tactics, organizational structure. So you couldn't ask for a better army in 1859 than what Victor Emmanuel commanded in the field.
The French army got into Italy quickly. How did they accomplish this logistical feat, and how prepared were they to fight with a partner against the Austrians? Did the Allies work well together?
The relationship between the Piedmontese and the French were, in many ways, I'd say the modern analogy, relative modern analogy, would be the relationship between the British and the Americans in the Second World War. There was an understanding of common cause. Certainly the French were keen at getting at the Austrians for historical reasons, and this was also played up by Napoleon III. They had recently thumped the Russians in the Crimea, which Napoleon III played up as revenge for 1812, and the opportunity for Napoleon III and the French to return to the glories of a Bonapartist campaign in Italy, as the great Napoleon had waged in '96, was certainly there. So there was common cause. There was certainly not necessarily brotherly love, and the French did look in many ways down on the Piedmontese as a lesser ally, but there was very good cooperation. Now, this cooperation extended to military planning and logistics at the strategic and operational level, as well as cooperation and coordination on the tactical level. The Piedmontese and the French had made a secret agreement at Plombières in 1858. Napoleon III signs a secret agreement with Camillo de Cavour, the Prime Minister of Piedmont, to come to Piedmont's aid if it was attacked by Austria. But this was a setup so that Cavour could goad the Austrians into attacking, which would then give the French the right by international law to come in and help its weaker ally. And this political military alliance had to be transformed into practical planning. And so in January 1859, under the guise of a marriage alliance between France and Piedmont, Napoleon III sends off his cousin to Piedmont to marry the daughter of King Victor Emmanuel. And the wedding, the person who was sent as the military attaché as part of that sort of diplomatic requirement of having a prince of the French Empire showing up in Piedmont for the wedding. It had to be accompanied by a senior general of the French Empire, is General Adolphe Niel. And Niel outwardly is there for window dressing, but really he's there to carry out specific and secret military planning for the transport of the French army from France to Piedmont, but that would also require extensive Piedmontese logistical support, as well as support from the Piedmontese army in those things that the French could not bring to Piedmont quickly. So there was extensive planning in January 1859 in Piedmont, while the wedding ceremonies were being planned and coordinated. While the bride and groom were tasting their wedding cake, Niel is off with the Piedmontese general staff to survey the frontier and the borders and the fortifications and the maps. And then in April 1859, beginning of April 1859, the Piedmontese send a delegation to Paris, where they're reaffirming those plans for this quick transfer of troops. The climate, international climate, would not permit France to start a war with Austria, nor did Napoleon III want it to seem as if that he had concocted this sort of excuse to go to war with Austria, even though it served Piedmont's purposes. And so the war had to be seen as purely defensive, and it had to be seen as ad hoc, that the French army wasn't ready, but Napoleon III had to help his ally as quickly as possible. And this is what it appeared to be when war is declared in April, at the end of April, April 23rd, I believe, 1859. Within hours, the declaration of war on Piedmont from Austria is transmitted to Paris, and orders are issued to the French army to mobilize and march to Piedmont. And in fact, the secret of this planning was kept so secret that you had senior French marshals like Marshal Castellan, Marshal Canrobert, most of those commanding French corps, complaining to Paris, what do you mean we have to go to Piedmont? We don't have supplies. We're not ready. We have no logistical support. This doesn't make sense. Our artillery is not ready. And the orders were, thank you for your feedback. Please fulfill your orders. Because what they didn't know was all of that planning had been done in advance, and everything that they needed would be waiting for them when they arrived in Piedmont. And so the French troops march across the Alps. You have French troops that are from Marseille and Toulon that sail to Genoa and land in Genoa, and then by train are taken to the frontiers, so that by the time the Austrians actually cross the frontier into Piedmont, by April 28th, 29th, there are well over 70,000 French troops sitting in Piedmont already, in addition to the 70,000 Piedmontese troops that are there. The Austrian army in northern Italy is no more than about 120,000, and they find themselves already outnumbered when they begin the invasion.
And some French came from Algeria as well, yes?
The Army d'Afrique was in Algeria, but it had already been transported to Marseille and Toulon by the time the war was declared. And this is another factor, is that in order to, the initial Piedmontese planning that was made with the French called largely for the transport of 2 or 3 corps, mostly overland, to Piedmont. But Napoleon III altered those plans to increase the French military commitment, and to that end to bring over more divisions from the Army d'Afrique. And to do that, they had to hire out French merchant ships. The French Navy was the second largest navy in the world, the British being the first. But the French Navy sea lift capacity was still inadequate to transport by sea the number of troops that Napoleon III wanted to bring over. So the transport of troops from Algeria was actually done prior to the declaration of war. In anticipation of the declaration of war, shortly after April 10th, when the Piedmontese had been in Paris to confirm the war plans, Napoleon III decided to increase the commitment of the French army to Italy. The Piedmontese had only expected perhaps 2, maybe 3 French corps, but in fact Napoleon III wanted to increase that number substantially to demonstrate the strength of the French army, but also to guarantee success in Italy. So shortly after April 10th, contracts were made with French merchants to use their steamships to transport divisions from the Army d'Afrique to Marseille and Toulon. so that when war was declared on Piedmont on April 23rd, those troops are already sitting in Marseille and Toulon and then could get on the ships and sail over to Genoa.
How about the Austrians? What was the state of their army in Italy?
The Austrian army in Italy had always been the best equipped, best trained, and best armed of the Austrian armies throughout their empire. This was something that the previous commander of the Austrian army in Italy had made sure of, and that was Field Marshal Radetzky, one of the most famous, if not the most famous, Austrian military commander in the 19th century. He commanded in Italy from the 1830s until his forced retirement in 1857. And he made sure that the Austrian army was always well equipped and well funded. It was his army in 1848 that saved the empire in Italy, and Franz Joseph, who was emperor in 1859, before he was emperor, when he's crown prince, found shelter in the revolutions of 1848 with Radetzky and the army of Italy in Verona in northern Italy. So the army of Italy played a very important role in the Habsburg Empire for maintaining power and control in Italy, but also in 1848-49 being the only army that successfully was well trained and loyal and was able to perform to its expectations due to its commander. And Radetzky made sure through 1857 that it remained the best paid, the best supplied, the best equipped, and the best trained. After 1857, the commander of the army, Gyulai, was not as good as Radetzky in terms of the respect he held with the other generals. The respect that was held between Radetzky and the soldiers was not there for Gyulai. Gyulai was very much a political animal and was paranoid that his position was insecure and that any officers, staff officers, or generals that were sent from Vienna to Italy were sent to spy on him. So he was a very insecure commander and was more an administrative officer, although he had served in the army in 1848. He had battlefield experience, but that did not make him a great strategist. The fact that there was a great deal of concern about Gyulai as a commander meant that the trust between Austrian generals in the army in Italy was not as good as it had been. There was very little trust that the junior or subordinate generals had to Gyulai. And by the same token, when you read memoirs of Austrian officers, junior officers, and soldiers from 1859, they all say when the army marches off to war, I wish old man Radetzky, or Papa Radetzky as they called him, was with us. And while the army was well trained, and certainly at the junior officer level, the brigade and divisional level was well led, its army leadership was quite poor. So it was a good quality professional army, but its highest leadership was in question.
We know that the armies were relatively evenly matched numerically. But what were some of the tangible differences in these armies as they faced each other that day in the hills and plains around Solferino, San Martino, and Medolle?
The tangible differences were several and notable. In terms of military technology, the Piedmontese army had yet to upgrade its line infantry to percussion cap rifled muskets. They had percussion cap smoothbore muskets, but they lacked the rifling, and that would not occur until after the war, which meant that the accuracy and the range of Piedmontese firearms was inferior to the Austrian Lorenz rifled musket. In terms of artillery, however, the Piedmontese had smoothbore muzzle-loading artillery, but the Austrians, despite having the technology, did not want to pay the cost for rifled artillery. And so in matters of artillery, it's equal in terms of technology. The French, however, had percussion cap rifled muskets, just as the Austrians did, and so it's equal in terms of technology. But the French had introduced, for this campaign specifically, the rifled muzzle-loading artillery, the Lahit system. And the Lahit artillery had already been adopted by the French army, and it was still in production by the time we get to January, February 1859, when Napoleon III and the French army was planning for this war. Napoleon III ordered the foundries to increase production as quickly as possible and ensured that every battery that was sent with the army of Italy to fight this war was equipped with Light artillery. Even if it was deployed to regiments or divisions or corps that were not going to be deployed for this war, they transferred the batteries. So the French uniformly have this rifled artillery. What's interesting is that the artillerists did not have a lot of time training with it. And so one of the things that we'll find in the initial engagements between the Austrians and the French, when the French are using Light artillery, is that the French artillerists are still trying to figure out the fuses and how to set the fuses for the shells. But they do figure it out by the time you get to Magenta, and certainly they know what they're doing by the time of Solferino. So technologically, that's the difference. Tactically, the Austrians maintain a tactical system that Radetzky had introduced, which focuses on shock rather than firepower. Radetzky believed that firepower was a waste of money and good men, and that attacking a la bayonet in these deep columns could achieve ground quicker and bring tactical and operational resolution to war. And so the Austrian troops were trained far more to operate in these columns that were screened by a company of skirmishers or Jaeger rather than form out into lines. That compared to what the French system was, or the Piedmontese system, which was based on the French tactical system. The French tactical system is much more flexible. They can move from attack column to line to skirmish order. And we have a very interesting situation where the French had also adopted a tactical system based upon the lessons they had learned in Algeria fighting since the 1830s. So they're working off of tactics that they had used that focused on rapidity of movement, marching double time, or the double quick, fighting in open order, dropping their packs to carry out the assaults, and to relying on the professionalism and skill and training of the soldiers and the initiative of the junior officers. If you look at French tactical manuals of the 1850s, they're actually the same exact manual that was introduced in 1792. But just because the manual told them to fight in the same way that, let's say, Napoleon I's armies had fought, we know that the actual training and tactics that were employed on the battlefield were integrated from the lessons learned in North Africa. And so one of the things that we find is that the French army is far more tactically flexible. And in fact, even though the French had eliminated light infantry regiments in favor of what were called the chasseurs à pied battalions, the elite light infantry battalions, many of the French infantry regiments that had historically been light infantry, in other words, that could carry out light infantry tactics, were still practicing light infantry tactics, even though they weren't supposed to be able to do this. And we see this at the Battle of Montebello, where one of the French infantry regiments breaks down completely into open order, which it's not supposed to be doing. And it really confounds the Austrian ability to conduct their tactics and to compete with the French in terms of screening infantry with light infantry, fighting in open order. And so we see a much more tactically flexible, much more nimble French army. The Piedmontese army is trained on the French system, so it is also more tactically nimble. And these things will play out on the battlefield, and they will compensate, certainly for the Piedmontese, for their lack of rifled muskets. But we'll also see the French, when they need to, can outmaneuver the Austrians on the battlefield.
Any other intangible differences? Anything further on that?
Well, I think that there's a greater esprit de corps, that the French army has a greater esprit de corps, and they are highly experienced. They have fought in Algeria, so in the Army of Africa. They fought in the Crimea, and their officers, both junior through senior officers, have substantial battlefield experience. In fact, even in different types of conflicts. And so that's going to play out. The Piedmontese are fighting for, well, obviously defending the kingdom, but they also are an army in which the rank and file supports the idea of national unification. And the Austrians were the historic enemy. And so I think that there's that idea of morale. The French morale is very high. The Austrian morale is very high. Sorry, not the Austrian, the Piedmontese morale is very high. The Austrian morale is good, but it's not. We'll see it play out on the battlefields, especially at Solferino, substantially differently.